I'm David Livingstone, not Stone, David Livingstone Smith.
Livingstone
Um,
Smith, and
yeah, that's how I pronounce it, David Livingstone Smith.
because there's another David Livingstone, like well, without the Smith. So I
Yeah, well, you see, my father was named David Livingstone Smith too, and he was named after the missionary David Livingstone. So that's how I get my name.
are you? Is he was he related to him?
No, no, but his parents were missionaries. He was born in Brazil, and they gave him the name of someone they admired.
All right. So you want to talk about that for a second? Because in On Inhumanity, you talk about your story
Hmm.
involving racism, and you mentioned your father who's Brazilian, and I'm just curious about his experience there and how he got there, and because then you said that he was sent
Yeah, well, he was sent back home, right? So,
he wasn't back
mm,
home, but wasn't he born there?
yes, but I mean, we're the origin of the family, so it's a little bit complicated. So, uh, my father came from an old Southern family. They immigrated to the United States from England in the 18th century, and they settled in Georgia and South Carolina, both of which are the Deep South. And they were a very religious, family.
Yeah.
My father's parents were both missionaries, Methodist missionaries, and they went to Brazil to to convert people to Methodism. Worked in leper colonies. Um,
What's
so,
Methodism? Sorry.
pardon?
What's Methodism?
Methodism. It's the sect of Christianity, the Methodist sect. In fact, my
Is it
father's father.
Protestant?
Yes, it's a Protestant sect. Yeah. So my father was born in Brazil, although his parents were not Brazilian, they were North American. And when he was in his early teens, this is the story I was told,
Yeah.
he fell in love with a black girl in Brazil, and his parents were horrified and sent him to the United States, back to the old family home in South Carolina, to 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 cut this short. Um, and so, in his teenage years, and of course his adulthood, he lived in the United States.
So your grandparents were in some way racist
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah, that, there's no doubt about it. I mean, they were
from Georgia.
they were from Georgia and South Carolina. They were from the Deep South. My father certainly, um, I would describe him as racist. I tend not to use the word racist because it has too many different meanings. So he was not hostile to black people. My wife is black, and he welcomed her with open arms. But he did have beliefs that, like, black people are lazy and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was part of the culture that he absorbed.
I'm confused because you say that your father started dating this black girl.
Yeah.
Did he become a racist when he uh, went
No,
to
well,
the?
yeah, that's an interesting question, right? So he was still pretty young. Um, so I don't know what beliefs he had at that point, but certainly as an adult, when I knew him and when I was old enough to understand notions like racism, uh, I I concluded that he had racist beliefs. Yeah.
Like what? Like that they were lazy? Is this like relating to welfare in some way?
No, no, he wasn't like that at all. Um, no, no, he was just so in his for a lot of his life he worked as a manual laborer. He did hard work in the sun, and I remember him casually remarking, "Well, as they spoke then, the Negroes are lazy." And the way he would refer, just the way he would talk about um, An elderly black man. He described as an old uncle, which is a Southern racist kind of term,
Yeah.
right? So it wasn't like anything sort of blatant or violent, but from the way he spoke, it was quite clear that he had these sorts of ideas in the back of his mind.
All right. And well, your mother wasn't as racist.
No, no, my mother
Not
wasn't. No, not at all. My mother and her parents. So yeah, I grew up in an extended family um, with my maternal grandparents for a lot of my
they were Jewish,
childhood.
right?
They were Jewish. Yes, they were Jewish. Essentially refugees. They came to the United States from Eastern Europe
Yeah.
uh, when they were both children. I mean, my grandfather was a baby when his family came here, and my grandmother about 3 years old. Yeah, no, they absolutely weren't. Quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. I
And
mean,
how
they.
did your well, how did your father's well, because well, his racism wasn't very explicit, but how did it relate with your with well, sorry, with his relationship to your mother, his wife?
Um, you mean because she was a Jew?
No,
Oh, oh, you mean that the contrast in their views? I don't know. I was too young
but
to.
was she ever like? Did he ever say something? I mean, were there ever arguments between them, like
Not about stuff
involving
like
that?
that. No, no, and again, my father wouldn't. He wasn't like he was a kind man. He would never um, speak aggressively about black people or anyone on the basis of how they're racially identified. He just wouldn't. He was kind and polite and gentle. It's just that he had, absorbed that culture that his parents were from and that from his early teenage years on he grew up in. But no, it's kind of hard to describe these subtleties, but no, that never occurred.
And it makes sense because I mean, he was from the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, that's right. And from a very particular cultural background as well, which was just saturated. So look, in the deep south, even when I was growing up in the deep south in the 1950s and 60s, racist ideas were just there. You People breathe them in with the air, right? It was just these things were just taken for granted as true by almost everyone.
Like you actually saw, because I had only seen it in pictures, obviously, but you actually saw like the signs that said "white people only"
Yeah. Oh yes, yes, yes,
racist
yes.
mountain.
That's right.
Can you talk a bit about like those that imagery
Sure.
that you saw?
Sure. So when you're a small child, so let me rewind my own brain a little bit here.
Sure.
So I my parents and me moved from New York City to Florida when I was 3 or 4 years old. And um, because of the environment which I grew up in, I didn't have any racist beliefs, right? So you're there as a child, a young child in this world, and you see these things, and it's really very puzzling. You know, why is it that there are white schools and black schools?
But
Why?
was it puzzling or did it hurt you in a way? Did it make you
Well, it was puzzling and distressing because when you're confronted with raw poverty, uh, which it was, I mean, the black section of town, it's a segregated town. It could be, it could have been any developing nation in the world,
yeah.
right? People were obviously hungry. Their homes were dilapidated. Um, I so my When my mother was pregnant with my brother, who was 6 years younger than me, she slipped and broke her arm, and she couldn't do the housework, so we hired. a maid, someone to do the housework. It was a black woman, as was always the case back then in
Yeah.
that place. And she had 2 kids that could sometimes come with her, and I'd play with them. And once we went to their house, there were a bunch of toys that I had outgrown, but her youngest child would make use of. So we delivered them. And in the house, it's like instead of furniture, there were stacks of newspapers tied with cords, right? It was that level of poverty.
Yeah.
And it it was puzzling and distressing and heartbreaking for a child who just couldn't make sense of that at at that time. I mean, my grandmother helped me to make sense of it.
Like you weren't a teen even, right?
No, no, I was not a teenager yet. I was, I can't tell you how old I was. Well, no, yeah, I probably can. I was
Really?
around 7 years old. Yeah, because my mother broke her arm prob- when I was 6.
Oh,
My
when
mother broke her
your
arm
mother
when
was
she was
already
pregnant
born.
with my brother. Yeah, yeah.
All right. And then how did you progress into your teenage years?
Well, um, so my grandparents used to visit in the summer and then go back to New York. And eventually, my grandfather retired um, from he had a factory job, and they moved to Florida and moved in with us. And my grandmother was a brilliant, self-educated person. My grandfather too, but my grandmother was actually more impressive in this
I'm
respect.
sorry. Were they poor in Europe?
Yeah, yeah. My grandfather was born in Belarus, and my grandmother was born in Romania.
But they were very poor.
Uh, Back in the old country, yeah, but
I mean, not the
not.
poverty you see like in
No, no, they
Western
weren't. I mean, they had. They. I wouldn't say they were poor in New York. They were a working class family, right? So my grandfather had a factory job in Coca-Cola factory. Uh, like many women of that time, my grandmother didn't work
yeah.
outside the home. I wouldn't say they were poor. They came from poverty. Particularly, my grandmother came from real poverty. It was her father abandoned the family in New York. She and her brothers, so they had to make it on their own, and she had to quit school at the age of 14, to work in what was called a sweatshop. Um, so
Wait,
yeah, they
what year was this? Because child labor laws came into account like in the beginning of the 20th century, right?
yeah, this would be. Oh, well, of course, as you know, there's a difference between what the law says and what actually
Yeah.
happens, right? This would have been about, well, I can tell you exactly, about 1920, around
The Roaring
1920.
20s.
Yeah. So,
Well, I didn't know that child labor laws took time to be enforced. I mean, it's usually the case with other types of laws, but I assumed maybe wrongly that
well, yeah, maybe. So, all you have to do is look at the exploitation of undocumented workers in the United States to to see. I mean, there's a black market in labor, and there
well,
was for her. Yeah, or all you have to do is look at slavery was technically illegal in the United States until from the 1860s onward.
yeah.
But we know now that in remote parts of the South, slavery persisted into well into the 20th century.
That's where I have some doubts with the story of black people in America since the Civil War.
Hmm.
And yeah, the story of the changes that have been around for the 20th century, because then you see stuff in the 60s that looks kind of like slavery, but sometimes it's not that. I mean, they're just like saying you can't come here, you can't do this, but they're not really forcing them into anything.
No, what I'm talking about, well, if we really want to go into it, beginning with convict leasing.
Sorry, with
So
what?
are you familiar with convict leasing?
Um, well, I'm familiar with both words, but
Okay, but their conjunction means something special.
yeah.
So, from the latter late 19th century on, so after the Civil War, the South's economy was ruined, right? The cotton was left in the fields, and the South had been tremendously wealthy. I believe it's the case that in 1861, the states that became the Confederate States were the third largest economy in the world. And
And
there were more millionaires in the state of Mississippi than anywhere else in the United States, even though Mississippi is now the poorest state. So the economy was wrecked. And part of the ruin was they no longer had free labor, right?
yeah,
Slavery was abolished.
did it
So
have to do
very
also with the destruction of their cities?
well, the destruction of their cities and all the infrastructure that would make, King Cotton work for them.
But mainly the free labor.
Well, I don't know if it was mainly, but it's certainly a big part of it. So various laws were passed which targeted African Americans um, specifically. And uh, what would happen then is that if you were, um, you could, as a black man, these were directed mainly towards men, not exclusively, but mainly, be arrested and then charged court fees. If you could not pay those fees,
Arrested for what?
oh, you could be arrested for not being able to prove that you were employed, for stealing a fence post, of walking along a railroad track.
Stuff that
There,
white
there,
Americans did not get
yeah,
convicted for.
no, 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 because the whole purpose of this was either the person went to jail, or the person went to jail. These arrests tended to happen at the times of the year, by the way, that there were labor needs, particular labor needs.
Yeah.
Um, uh, they were then sold to industry. So they could work off their legal debts by being sold to industry to work in, say, the coal mines of Alabama or the turpentine camps of Florida, whatever.
So they were virtually obligated still.
Well, yeah, and it was actually worse than being in slavery because you
Really.
have to understand that slave owners, a lot of the wealth of the South was in human beings, right? Slave owners did not want to kill their slaves or damage them so badly that they work. That was not in their interest at all. But industry could essentially buy people so cheaply that they were literally worked to death. They, just get another one, bang, 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 bang. This proliferated and continued until the US government really cracked down on it.
When?
Seriously, and that was in the 1940s.
Wow.
So I could refer you to a wonderful book called Slavery by Another Name. In fact, you can watch a very good video on this, based on this book, which I showed to my students in my race class. Um, the author is Doug Blackmon, Blackmon, I believe.
And is he a black man?
No, he's not. He's a white man from Mississippi. Um, so there was that, but there was also, we know from particularly one person who worked in Louisiana interviewing elderly Black people, that in the 1950s, in remote parts of Louisiana, there were people working on farms, Black people working on farms. They could be killed if they tried to leave. They were beaten. It was in effect slavery, and they knew nothing about the civil rights movement. They were so isolated. So, the story, slavery gets abolished by Lincoln, and then it's the civil rights movement. Well, then it's Jim Crow, which is a word I don't like because people generally don't understand what it means. And then there was the civil rights movement. That's what I call the cartoon version of.
What do people understand that it means, and what is it actually?
Well, right. So I'll tell you what
Briefly, if you want.
I have a laboratory because I teach these undergraduates about race, racism, and beyond. It's one of my courses. So the picture that
Is it a historical class or like a psychological class?
it's a philosophy class, but uh, philosophy to me is a kind of interdisciplinary scholarship.
Yeah.
So I do history and I do anthropology. I do all sorts of things in that class. So my view on any question is any meaningful question is we simply have to draw on all the resources that are going to help us answer that question, whatever they are, and not stick to one discipline or another, because the world isn't like that. The world isn't organized like a university with departments, right? It's one big reality. And and to really understand that, it's kind of complicated. We have to come at it from different sides. So yeah, so when I asked them what was Jim Crow, well, they think Jim Crow is was just like segregated schools and segregated drinking fountains. They have no idea until I get a hold of them and teach them these things. The level of oppression and violence and just sheer terrorism that was inflicted on Black people in the South. I speak a lot when I give talks. Very often, I on dehumanization. I give the example, and I speak about quite a bit these events called spectacle lynchings,
Yeah.
which were lynchings primarily of Black men um, that were
Yeah, you
public
described one
events.
quite horribly at the beginning of
Yes,
Less Than Human.
yes, that's right. That's the one where the young man was tortured for, I believe it was 12 hours, and forced to eat his own severed
With an
genitals.
audience of around thousands of people.
Well, yeah, no, in his case, it wasn't. There was
Or was
supposed
it
to
the other
be.
one?
Yeah, I don't remember the examples that I gave.
But there was
Um,
an audience in one, and that's what amazed me.
okay, so that was probably, yeah, that was probably either the Henry Smith or the Sam Hose lynchings. Yeah, thousands of people. In one of them, there was between 10 and 20,000 people. One of those two lynchings, the other was maybe 5,000 people. These were advertised events. There were photographers there taking pictures and turning them into postcards. Um, so many Southern families had these postcards of people being tortured, burned alive, things of this nature. Uh, yeah, and it was just horrible. It's like something you would think maybe took place in the 13th century, right? It's
Yeah.
so and it was men, women, and children all coming to watch. And then they would, after the person, well, often before the person was killed, take body parts as souvenirs.
Yeah.
Take a finger or a penis or a bit of bone. And people sold these things as well. I mean, it was very, very grotesque. So, the segregated water fountains and so on, that was just like a little bit of fluff on top of a history of such extreme violence and oppression. It's unthinkable, really.
And well, surely there's still tons of racism in the world, but there has been a lot of change,
Absolutely.
definitely. And my question is, how did the violence against Black Americans after the Civil War evolve from then to when you were alive, and probably to the end of the century? Was it legislative things that made it happen, or was it social changes? Because there haven't been any amendments to the Constitution including Black Americans since the ones
Yeah.
for
Well,
rights.
part of it is, of course, enforcement rather than new legislation.
But government
But
enforcement or from the society?
both. So, look, if let's take the desegregation of schools in the South.
70s, right?
yeah, that required muscle, right? That required these kids being protected from white mobs, right?
Yeah,
Well, there are many things that weren't cracked down on until Black people took legal action themselves, like predatory lending. There was a system whereby, and this is particularly associated with Chicago, um, the uh, Black people wishing to buy a home. I'm thinking because I want to get this right.
sure.
Um, were required were right. So in the first place, there was a lot of straight up housing discrimination, which was entirely it was entirely legal,
Yeah.
and that persists to some extent. Just by the way,
The gerrymandering, right?
that's right. So it's called redlining,
Yeah,
right? Where people, Black people not in this neighborhood, and Black people were often placed in neighborhoods, say where was industrial waste and things like this. I've seen that myself in today's South, just by the way, in Alabama. So um, the way it worked was you purchased this house, but you were essentially renting it. There was a third party that purchases the house, and then you pay that third party. But the deal was, if you missed a single payment, you lost everything, right?
wow.
You know, and so not you're working with your hands or something like that. A week of illness, you could destroy every bit of money you put into that, everything gone. So there were all these sorts of things which were altered in that case by, I believe I'm correct in saying, in Black people taking legal action, persistent legal action against this practice. Um, there was, legislation for the integration of the schools. There were social changes. There are lots of things that happen, and all these things interact, right?
But still in the 70s, well, Richard Nixon pulled out the drug war to specifically target Americans and hippies.
Mm.
It's it's funny because it's not explicitly against Black Americans, but it's explicitly against users of heroin, which are
Yeah, yeah, sure. So
disproportionately Black.
these things get coded, right? So an example would be, again, I'm speaking about things that I don't have real detailed knowledge of, so forgive me if I get something slightly wrong.
Yeah, sure.
The Roosevelt's New Deal, which part of it was offering unemployment insurance to people.
Did it
It was a
discriminate?
very Hmm?
Did it discriminate?
Well, it did in effect. So Roosevelt needed to get the Southern folks on board with this. So he agreed to exclude farm workers and domestic workers.
How?
They just would not be covered, right? It's simple. They would not be covered. Most Black workers were in the South, farm workers and and uh, and domestic workers. So that was a kind of a deal that was struck. The word Black was never mentioned, but it had that consequence.
Yeah. And then that combined with all the benefits that the white soldiers got after World War II,
That's
and the
right,
benefits that the Black soldiers
which
did not get.
created the big American middle class. Right? People could buy homes, and yeah, yeah. So the Black Americans were left behind by Roosevelt, and so then we have the persistent Black poverty. We have the ghettos, which were essentially created early on. We don't have the intergenerational transmission of wealth. Uh, we have the legacy of the segregated schools, which were horrible, and that just carries on. And it's plus, of course. plus racist attitudes, which are in the mix and make a difference and could easily be exploited. So, it's a matter of really slow, painful progress, way too slow. I mean, it's so cruel and horrible. And then, of course, we have mass incarceration as part of that legacy as well.
And it's funny because more more drug dealers are white, but more Black Americans
Sure, sure. Yeah, that's right. You get more arrests and stiff charges. Yeah.
So I didn't want to go there just yet, but I think it's
Okay.
relevant. So, what's a a prominent solution to this problem? Because people talk about, for example, reparations,
Hmm.
which sounds complicated.
Hmm.
I do agree that it's fair. So, well, what's your view on legislative ways
Solution.
to approach the racial wealth gap?
Solutions are always the hard part, aren't they?
Yeah,
Uh,
but what's a good method? I mean, what's
right.
what's a good way
So,
of tackling it?
right. So here, I think we could start with something very, very minimal. Um, a few things very minimal. And again, this is far away from my real level of area of expertise.
Ah, yeah,
So
clearly.
take it with a grain of salt, right? I think reparations are extremely important, but the first step is for Congress to seriously consider reparation. We haven't even got there,
Yeah,
right? Right? So take it on board as something serious. There's this massive injustice. People are hurting, people are suffering, people are dying, right? The United States government has, in all sorts of ways, its hands dirty in this. So let's think about that. Let's look at the evidence and let's think about ways that we might be able to put this right, at least a little bit, because that won't put it all right, right? Now that's a fantasy. See, here's the thing that this stuff has been, despite the changes that have occurred, and they are outstanding. I mean, my wife and I could not legally be married in many states in the United States if it were 50 years ago or even less.
that's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's say this is taken up seriously. Oh yeah, I remember where I was going with it. So um, this is the issue of the oppression of Black people and of Native Americans, by the way, but we're talking about Black people right now, has never been properly taken up in this country. And the reason for that, I think, is because we've never been brought to our knees, right? So Germany was brought, like with the Holocaust, Germany, they had to, right? They absolutely had to.
What do
They,
you mean by
they,
bringing us to our knees?
we've never been, we've never suffered as a nation punishment, which would require us to abandon certain illusions about our history, right? And so this idea of American exceptionalism persists,
Yeah,
and that's incompatible with the recognition of these horrors. Um, so this is all these very persistent ideological illusions, deeply rooted in American culture, not as, in fact, probably much more commonly explicitly um, expressed than you might imagine. But even when they're not, it kind of simmers away below the surface. So it's a problem. It's a festering boil that has been in our society for well, really for centuries, and so it's very difficult to um, to solve in a stroke. It can't be solved in a stroke, but certainly seriously considering reparations I think is very important because that shows that you're seriously recognizing that there has been and still is tremendous injustice. You know, words themselves are just cheap, right? It's like these apologies. We apologize for what we did. Yeah, right. Well, put your money where your mouth is, right? Words are cheap.
Now, on reparations, not all Black Americans are descended from slavery.
No,
Is that a significant number of Black Americans? Is it something important to take into
I don't
account?
think. Well, first of all, I don't think it's a significant number, but there's one of the things that's really wrong about that kind of line is, first of all, we shouldn't see it as reparations for slavery, right? Slavery is part of the picture, but there's everything that came after, which merits reparations. The mass lynchings, the living in fear, the shortened lifespans, the infant mortality, the history of economic exploitation, right? So as soon as someone says reparations for slavery, I say, hold on. We're actually talking about, we should be talking about a lot more than that.
That's really interesting.
And in fact, as far as I'm concerned, although slavery is causally obviously very, very significant for all of that, we could even leave that out of the picture. Let's talk about the brutal oppression of African Americans, let's say just in the century following 1865, right? So this is yesterday. I mean, really, slavery in its original form was just yesterday. When I was growing up in the South, say in the 1950s, some of the, I would think most of the elderly Black people that I saw were sons and daughters of slaves. And I may even have seen very old people who had been born into slavery, right? It's not like way, way in the past. And certainly the lynchings, like the spectacle lynchings, they came right up into the 20th century. And the government persistently refused to make lynching a federal offense. Right? That's still going on. so, um, so that's how we should conceive of it. And of course, um, there will be some recent immigrants, Black immigrants to the United States, like my wife is from Jamaica, who um, had no, I mean, her issues would be with the British, right? the British slaveholders and oppressors. But that's just how it is. Of course, these things are always rough and approximate and so on. Big deal. I mean, the Jews who received checks from Germany after the Holocaust.
Oh, they did?
Yes, yes, yes. There were reparations. Um, well,
How big was that program?
I think it was a small amount, although Germany
But
paid a
like,
lot
did
to
it
Israel.
reach a large amount of Jews?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, like some of those Jews probably didn't suffer. Some, were hidden away or whatever. No big deal.
Yeah.
It's not about individuals anyway. It's about a group of people, right? It's about a population. So, so I see all of those objections as really without substance.
I want to talk about, well, dehumanization, obviously,
Yeah.
but the difference between when something is sociologically or politically made, or when something is biologically or from nature.
Hmm.
Clearly, that there have been many legislations like targeting specific groups,
Yeah.
definitely. But how much is that rooted in biology?
So when you say that, what are you referring to? How much is what rooted in?
Our necessity to legislate against the out groups.
Well, so here's the way. First of all, I don't see Biological development is always in the context of an environment. In our case, biological development is in the context of not just a physical environment in the simple sense, but a social environment and a political environment. So we can't really segregate these things. We can do it conceptually. We could say,
Where do
well,
you draw the line? Because I think it's something that's important.
I don't draw the line. Um, if the idea is that um, intergroup hostility is innate, I have some questions about that too. First of all, I'm not sure what the word innate can mean lots of different
Yeah,
things. You're right. So I tend to avoid it. Is it somehow inevitable? I don't think so. I don't think there's any reason to think that. But even if it is, what we have to realize in our species is, let me come at this slightly differently. Let's say we're considering a bunch of chimpanzees, and we have what psychologists like to call in group and out group. So there's this one troop of chimpanzees, and then they have their neighbors, and they're hostile to each other and they fight. Well, amongst chimpanzees, the in group is just the local breeding group, right? But in the case of human beings, that's not the case. We draw lines, right? We differentiate ourselves. Now, I would say politically, in the very broad sense of political. So we create us and them. And as history unfolds, they might become us, part of us, and part of us might become them, right? So the boundaries with respect to human beings are really immensely flexible. So we can't start from the idea that there is an in group and an out group. We have to see these things as social creations. Now,
but people
yeah,
see them like that.
pardon?
They're social creations, but most people can't distinguish.
That's right. Yes. But the point is they're as social creations, right? So things that are created can be uncreated. And history shows us that all the time, right? If you look at the history of the world, allies become allies, become enemies, and so on and so forth. So, uh, yeah, it might be that there is some tendency, as the social psychologists mostly claim, to when we demarcate groups um, to have a certain hostility towards them. I don't even think that's inevitable. I mean,
But what's the difference between something that's naturally occurring between inside our bodies?
yeah.
I mean, maybe it's evitable.
Hmm.
Sorry, maybe we can avoid it.
Yeah.
Um, is it still? I mean, is that necessity still something that arises from nature, or is it something that we've tried to enforce?
Well, nothing arises, virtually nothing, and I would say nothing about human behavior just arises from nature. They're products of development. And right, so a fertilized ovum has no there's has no notion of in group and out group,
Yeah.
right? And no attitude. So as we develop, as we're subjected to various influences, our our attitudes take shape. And what that means, this is I mean this very radically, that human beings, in fact, all organisms, but we're talking about human beings, are deeply entangled with the environments in which they live. So, if I could reframe your question in a way that I think is easier to think about,
These do.
the question would be, is it the case that under all ex- in all expectable environments, people will have these sorts of antagonisms to those who they think of as the others. Well, I don't know. I doubt it. It's an empirical question. We can't just look at people as they are and draw a conclusion about that,
Yeah.
because people are subjected, as we know, all over the world. There are political rivalries, there are racialized hostilities, there are ethnic conflicts, and so on. So we're kind of subjected to these things from very, very early on. Um, and I really doubt the generalization that intergroup hostility is inevitable. I think it is evitable, but we need to understand human
That'll work.
development a lot better. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to hostility, because one thing which I've seen that is I've seen it asked you sometimes. Does one have to necessarily dehumanize their enemy to hurt them?
No, absolutely not. Many people attribute that view to me, but I don't have it.
It seems like you stress over that point quite a bit. Like well, not that everything is a cause of for dehumanization, but I do see how in many cases to be able to hurt someone else, you need to.
No, you don't. Look, first of all, there are people who just like to hurt other people. So the 2 or 3% of any population that are sociopaths, just don't care. Now let's leave them out of the picture. For the rest of us, um, here's the thing. Here's the thing. Look, we are highly social animals. There is no mammal that's as social as we are. And indeed, our success as a species is largely responsible to that. So we engage, in cooperative efforts in large groups. We have remarkable levels of trust towards one another, and so on. Now, all social animals have to have inhibitions against harming other members of their community for obvious reasons, right? If you're ripping each other's throats out, you can't cooperate. You can't cooperate. You
Yeah.
can't sustain a social way of life. And you can see this in lots of different species. That doesn't mean that members of a community of social animals never harm each other. They do. But it's usually not lethal or even anywhere close. So we're super social. And we therefore must have some pretty potent inhibitions against doing serious harm to fellow community members. Okay, and now there's a little bit more here. Unlike many animals, and I think this is because we're so damn smart, we've got these big brains. We we recognize the same inhibitions apply to strangers, right? So if I were to meet someone who doesn't live in my neighborhood, I still am reluctant to do violence to them. Uh, the And part of that is that we're just very, very attuned. Part of our sociality, you see, is we're very attuned to one another's humanness.
That bears the question: how are we even capable of dehumanizing when we're
Well,
so
that's the
rooted?
next point. So we're also like really smart and able to think instrumentally, and we're able to think, wow, wouldn't it be great to our neighbors over there have all these resources? Wouldn't it be great to just take it for that? Would be really beneficial for us, or to enslave them, to exterminate them, to avoid competition for resources or things like that. But then the problem is, well, we've got these inhibitions against performing these acts of extreme violence. And what I think is the case And this is, of course, speculative. Whenever we talk about the deep past, it's speculation. Over the centuries, over the millennia, we human beings developed cultural means for disinhibiting aggression against other human beings. We found ways of disabling those inhibitions. Now, dehumanization is one of those methods, specifically dehumanizing propaganda, which encourages the rest of us to dehumanize, but it's not the only one. Um, and we know this from anthropological work. Certain ritual practices, get people revved up, get them into altered states of consciousness where they can go out and kill. The use of drugs and alcohol, certain religious ideologies, and so on. Those are all things that can be brought to bear to get people to do terrible things to one another.
Yeah.
Um, and dehumanization is just one. I think it's a very important one, but it's just one. And of course, there are people whose whole personalities have been shaped by by trauma and adversity, who just that capacity for sympathy has just been crushed out of them. But that's none of those. That's not the norm.
Um, a question regarding that. I don't want to dive into the if sociopaths are just simply unable to be empathetic, or if there's such a thing as being empathetic and using it for the wrong terms.
Yeah, empathy is unfortunately a very broad term. So let's leave the term sociopath out and just say people who like to make other people suffer. Okay? Well, you have to understand in order to do this, in order to make other people suffer, you have to understand their state of mind, right? You have to understand what it's like to be them. Um, so empathy in that sense, yeah, they have to have it. They wouldn't know what hurts or what maximally hurts another person.
I think it's wrongly assumed that empathy is automatically a good thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, empathy can lead us into all sorts of committing all sorts of injustices, by the way. This was recognized by David Hume in the 18th century because our back then it was called sympathy. Uh, uh,
What's the difference?
uh, I'm not sure there is a real difference.
Okay.
It depends. People use this word empathy in so many different ways.
Yeah.
When the 18th century philosophers talked about sympathy, they meant basically the tendency to resonate with the feelings of another person. So, you know, I see that you're sad, that makes me sad. I see that you're happy, it makes me happy, and so on, like that. So, I mean, Jung pointed out that I'll use the modern term empathy. Empathy tends to be biased. So
Incredibly.
there's some people who count and some who don't count or don't count as much. And he even identified three biases. He said we're biased in favor of those who we think are similar to us, those who we think are related to us, and to those who are physically nearby. Right? So if I see that you are suffering, for instance, that's going to matter more to me than if someone tells me a bunch of people in Zambia are dying of starvation.
That's
That's the
kind of why
difference.
the advent of smartphones changed our perception of the damages abroad, because now we can actually see them in our phones.
That's right. It can bring us up closer to them. Yeah.
Yeah. And also that's why many people think that problems like racism and everything are going up.
Mhm.
Even I mean, they're kind of
Yeah.
going down very steadily, not as fast as they should, but it seems like they're going up because every time we have more and more data.
Yeah, of course. And of course, when, Black people have been reporting for decades and decades about police brutality, but unless you see it, So if the biases are already there, well, they're black people, you can't believe anything they say. And you haven't seen it, so the tendency is to discount it. But when that cop was murdering George Floyd, and we have a recording of it, you just can't. It's much harder to discount that. So the information is more available to white people than was the case not too long ago. And so when the information becomes more available, people think, "Oh my God, this is." Well, some people think, "Oh my God, this is increasing," but it's not. It's not, as far as I know, it's not increasing.
So, what about feeling dehumanized without the aggressor's intent? What about a feeling of feeling subhuman, like as an individual?
Hmm. Without,
Does that arise without political implications?
um, well, any look, when we're dealing with human beings or any other organism for that matter, variation is the key, right? So yeah, of course it could. Of course it could. But dehumanization, right? So I mean, a person might feel if they're subjected to certain experiences, because this doesn't come out of the air, that the people around them think of them as some other kind of creature,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, sure, and 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 that could be for all kinds of reasons, not necessarily that they are in fact being dehumanized by others.
All right. Now you make a lot of mention of the word monsters.
Yeah,
Like you say, because when we dehumanize another person, we're combining the image of another
good.
human being with
Hmm.
not that.
Yeah,
And well, all of this brings me to the people who say that those who are wrong are monsters.
yeah,
I think is very dangerous, even if the people who they're talking about do wrong things. Well, for example, when the left dehumanizes the right, they start alienating them. I worry if, well, first of all, I'm puzzled if that's actually dehumanization, and I worry that they end up uh, doing the same thing that they were fighting against.
yeah. So even if it isn't dehumanization, it's bad. So we don't have to worry too much about that. And of course, there is genuine dehumanization that happens there. So look, here's the thing. So I mean, let's start from where you started about people referring to others who do terrible things as monsters. Well, I think that's really dangerous for a couple of reasons. One is monsters are fictional. There aren't any monsters. People who do those who do these really bad things are human beings, just like you and me. So in describing them as monsters, what people are trying to do, I think, is distance themselves.
Yeah,
It's like this is an entirely different kind of being than I am. This person is nothing like me, and that's exactly the wrong attitude because
like rape in a way. People want to put all rapists in jail without noticing that rape is a symptom of people who are deeply wrong inside,
yes.
wrong by the
So
society.
I mean, whatever view you have about the incarceration of rapists, I think rapists should be incarcerated, but I don't think incarceration should be punitive. But that's another conversation.
Yeah,
The point is, I mean, as Plato said, you don't improve people by damaging them, and that's what the prison system does. It just damages already damaged people more, right? So what we should be doing is seeing these people who do terrible things as a mirror to see ourselves reflected in them. Because if we're going to understand, if we're going to get on top of dehumanization, if we're going to resist it, the subtitle of my book, Dehumanization and How to Resist It,
yeah.
we have to understand that the propensity to dehumanize lies in all of us, subjected to the right influences we're capable of that. And I know people like to think that they're not. And I know what I say to them is, look, do you really think if you were a young person growing up in Germany in the 1930s, you would somehow have distanced yourself from the Nazi cause? I doubt it. I doubt it very much. So rather than create that kind of distance from these people, we need to accept this is part of human potential, as it were. Um, and calling them monsters is just well, it's dehumanizing the dehumanizers. Really, it's just not good, and it goes in the opposite direction of where people should be going.
It's why I worry, because well, I usually root for progress and liberalism, but
Hmm.
then the extreme left starts, for example, like Antifa,
Hmm.
starts being fascist in a way, which is incredibly ironic. And I worry about the implications that might have. Like, if we come to solve the problems of racism and discrimination against minorities through those methods, I worry that the society that we arrive to will be prone to the same injustices. And is
Yeah.
that right? Do you
Well,
relate to that?
yeah, yeah. I think I think it's profoundly unhelpful simply to regard the other people as evil and malevolent. There are malevolent people, but that's just unhelpful. I'm a humanist, right?
Yeah.
I think we need to try to undo these sorts of divisions between people. And my approach, on social media, I very often encounter people who are aggressively opposed to the positions I take.
What do
Um,
they say, for example?
oh, they'll just argue with me about, say that um, black people are criminal or inferior or whatever, or the more extreme cases, Jews are running the world. And
So you get
I wish
criticism
it
from
was
the
the
right.
case. I would have more stuff, right? Uh, it's a great idea, but somehow I got left out of this. Um, all this kinds of the drill. The, um,
You get criticisms mainly from the right.
yeah,
Do you get any from the left?
yeah, but not as much. Not as much.
Understandably, because you're
Yeah, because if I have to use that language, I'm on the left. I don't like the language of identity groups, and left and right have stopped becoming descriptive and have become identity group labels.
yeah. It doesn't mean what the word used to.
No, it doesn't. No. So look, my view is that people can change, and my initial reaction, unless someone is really, 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 really toxic and violent, but my initial reaction is, okay, let's have a conversation. Let's have a conversation. And it's often the case these people they're smart people. They're just in the grip of certain ideological influences and have never had the opportunity to reflect on whether their ideas made sense or not. And so we have a conversation. And if I try anyway, and if that becomes impossible, I say, okay, that's it. Um, so
To engage with people online.
yeah,
Many
yeah.
people have decided not to.
Yeah, well, why not? It's a means of communication. I mean, if I didn't engage with them online, I wouldn't engage with them at all. They're not around where I
Some
am.
might say that it's counterproductive in some cases.
Might be. We never know um, how things are going to work. But I think minimally, even if we get to the point as well, conversation's impossible here. because the person does not want to play by the rules of the game and having a conversation. Even then, I think, well, maybe I planted a little seed of doubt in their head. Maybe they have an experience with someone on the left and can't very easily say this guy is uh, um, is evil or stupid or whatever the term of abuse is. Who knows? So look, my view is we have to try and do the right thing, and we, it might work out, it might not work out. I'm not too optimistic about the world,
Yeah, that was
but
very clear
but
in
I
your
write my
previous book.
books like this book because I want to change the world, and I know I'm not going to succeed in doing that, but I have to use what there is at my disposal to try and have a positive influence on things.
Um, how did because On Inhumanity came out in May, right?
The ebook came out in May. The book itself, the paper book, came out July the 1st.
So just now on my question is how have the protests and all the stuff about racism happening
Mhm.
right now in America affected your book? Have you, I mean, have you had people contact you because of it, or
Um,
did it seem too timely that it came out when this happened for you?
well, unfortunately, dehumanization never goes out of style. I mean, there's always something. Um, yeah, there's one guy who contacted me and was wondering if I would be interested in doing developing anti-dehumanization training for the police, and that came directly out of the George Floyd stuff.
Yeah.
Um, I've also had a lot of attention from a group of it's descendants of Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, who I've done some things for, and they're going to be promoting a book talk. So yeah, of course, there's stuff in the air, and everyone says, this is so timely given what's going on
Yeah.
uh, in the United States, and I would add the world because there are the protests in the United States, but the rise of authoritarian leaders worldwide is a troubling
Oh yeah,
development.
India is dehumanizing Muslims right now in
That's
North.
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we've got India, we've got Poland, we've got Hungary, we've got Brazil, we've and we've got Donald Trump. So yeah, it's pertinent in that respect as well.
Uh, well, from your opinion, is Donald Trump a racist, or does he just say whatever gets him elected?
Or both.
Yeah,
Um,
probably. But which one is more of it?
uh, well, it's it depends what you mean by racist. That's a word I don't like to use.
Can we go there first then?
Yeah, sure. So the question would be, why don't you like to use it? I don't like to use it because, well, let me give you two aspects to this. One is it means too many different things. So for most Americans, if you say racist, the way they interpret it is someone who hates black people because they're black. Now, if that's the case, then I know white supremacists who are not racist, which is ridiculous. And in fact, if that's the case, slave owners weren't racist. They didn't hate their slaves.
They
It's just
destroyed
like they
themselves.
didn't hate their farm machinery, right? They just used them. Um, so,
So it's not
so
demeaning the others much as it is like rising yourself over them.
if I have to use the word racism, which I have to do because it's what everyone does, if I want to communicate with people, racism is, to my mind, the belief, first of all, that races exist and that some races are intrinsically inferior to others. And that doesn't imply hate. See, I think all this talk about hate speech and hate crimes, that's really missing the point.
Yeah, I agree.
Um, it prevents us from understand things that we really need to understand properly. So
So
that's one piece of it. The other piece is I think it's very useful to change the language to be more descriptive for a lot of these things. When the same terminology is used again and again and again and again, it becomes dead. So, one that's going that way right now is police brutality. I think it's much more, it'd be much more effective to talk about criminal actions by police officers, criminal violent actions by police officers, right? That tells us more.
That's
People
an
hear,
important line to cross.
yeah, but that's what it is. I mean, a police officer arrests someone and beats the shit out of them and they die. I mean, that would be called police brutality. In fact, police brutality is way too broad. It includes too many things.
And
And
it's,
people
it
just
sounds
blank
like
out.
it could not be it could not be a crime.
Yeah, that's right. Let's call it what it is. So, and we should do the same in cases where we're inclined to use the term racism, right? Because, let's say that you're a white supremacist. I'm sure you are not. But let's say you're a white supremacist. And
I'm a
I
Muslim,
say,
so
yeah, well,
one
that
Muslim.
brings up something very interesting, actually, because,
I'm not Muslim. Sorry, I'm just descendant from Lebanese people.
okay, okay. Well, Muslim has become a racial term in the United States,
Yeah,
actually,
it's a conflict.
right? So the Boston bombers were as white as snow. I mean, the Americans couldn't make sense. They were Muslims. So they were other. Um, where was I going? Yeah, so if let's say you're a white supremacist, I say you're a racist. Well, you could say, no, I don't hate black people. I don't hate black people. Some people say that in good faith. So let's get away from that way of talking. Let's specify. I mean, let's say what we mean
So what
rather
do
than
they
using,
mean when they say they don't hate black people?
well, someone like, say, Jared Taylor, who is he calls himself a white advocate. Uh, yeah, he's one of the more influential, I'll use the term racists in the.
But what's
So he
his
would say, no. He just said, white people and black people are different, and it's natural to want to be around your own kind. So we need to advocate for white only places. We have to stop immigration of non-white people. And every human group is just fine, but they need to be left to themselves. And of course, packed into that is all kinds of stuff about black people being inherently criminal and having poor impulse control and being dumb and being hypersexual, all those stereotypes. But he would consistently deny that he in fact would consistently deny that he's a white supremacist.
it
Uh,
doesn't seem like it.
yeah, but if you listen to him, you Google Jared Taylor,
I'll
and
do it.
you'll get the feel of it.
Jared Taylor.
Yeah,
Right.
he has numerous videos up on online.
All right. I'm sure he's very entertaining.
He's not crude, he's an intelligent and sophisticated person. Um,
And it's just that I think that for example, the left is ready to cross that guy as an enemy of their cause, which in
yeah,
some
and
ways he
he
is.
is he is. I mean, they would be right. I don't like talking about the left and the right, actually.
I mean, I saw that, but I think it's relevant still. I guess
Yeah,
you get what I'm saying.
yeah. He is the enemy of I think actually enemy of the cause of many people on the right as well. Um, and with some justification. That doesn't mean one shouldn't have a conversation with him. So, and
Yeah,
that doesn't mean you should just, say he's a monster or he's a racist. That doesn't get us anywhere. I think we have to keep our eyes on what's the goal here? What are we trying to do?
right.
Right? Um, so I was talking to my wife about this the other day, and she said, look, there are people, I get this from time to time. Oh, he's a white guy talking about race. And that's supposed to be something bad. But as she said, look, if you think that white people are the problem, then you must think that they're also the solution, right? White people need to speak up and address these
And
issues.
isn't it racist to start saying that white people can't talk about it?
Well, as you know, I don't use the term racist.
Yeah, but racist for
I
what
think
people
it's
mean.
I think it's ridiculous. Nobody owns race, and everyone who has something to say should speak.
So
And
I
if
want
I
to.
have privilege, if I have privilege as a white person, I don't like the I have objections to the white privilege language as well, but it's not the objections that some of the people on the right have. But let's leave that aside for the moment. Suppose if I have privilege, like people are going to take me more seriously than if it was a black person talking about race.
Yeah, that's
Well, great. They take me seriously. And part
like
of taking me serious, maybe they'll take seriously that they shouldn't take me more seriously than a black person talking about race.
in Mexico, the feminism movement is kind of spiking up right now because of a rising number in murders of women.
Mm,
And what's starting to happen is the alienation of men inside the movement. Like men
right.
cannot fight for women's rights because they don't know or they can, but they're allied to the movement. They're not part of it.
Yeah.
Is that dangerous? Because I think it is.
I think it's unhelpful.
Yeah, it's unhelpful because you're just gonna put more people against you.
Yeah. I mean, if we're fighting for justice, we need all the you know
The hands we can
all
get.
the arms in the fight that we can get.
So I want to get a bit more into that because well, you teach at university.
Mhm.
Well, I'm sure that you've seen some of the stuff that social justice warriors, as they're called. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, I've been called one.
You've been called a social justice warrior,
Mhm.
but you're also saying that you don't agree with terms like white privilege, and I think that I don't think that most social justice warriors would be 100% in agreement with you.
Well, yeah, again, social justice warrior is one of these
Very broad term.
categories that, and in effect, it's a slur. It's a way to
Yeah, obviously.
marginalize people. And as far as I'm concerned, hey, sounds pretty good. Being a warrior for justice, man, I'm not. I'm a coward, but it sounds really good. Yeah, there are a lot of people that disagree with me. Um, I agree with the philosopher Naomi Zach that we should be talking about justice instead of privilege, that there are injustices.
So
Um,
what I'm trying to get at here is things like trigger warnings at school.
I use those. I don't call them trigger warnings. And if I can explain why,
Yeah, please.
I didn't take it seriously at first. Uh, then one day, it was in my one of my introductory courses to philosophy. I showed a film about the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. Are you familiar with that? You know, the American soldiers who murdered over 500 Vietnamese
During
villagers.
the war?
Yeah, and it was covered up, and it was a very brave journalist who exposed it. Um, so I showed this film. Then afterwards, one of my students came up to me. He was a combat veteran, and he said, "You know, it was really hard for me to sit through that. Um, I think you should let people know in case there are any veterans in your class before you show that film." And I thought, yeah, yeah. I mean, this guy had been subjected to the traumas of war, and it was really hard for him. He was a soldier. He put on a brave face, but what he really wanted to do is run out of the room. I don't like the word trigger warning.
Yeah,
I
I
think that's
understand that the
overly
word is strong.
dramatic. I use the term content warning. It's a term coined by Jennifer Saul. And
And
and if I even use the term, I say to students, look, there's going to be some really rough stuff I'm going to be showing you when I'm using a film about lynching. So I need to let you know, and if you can't handle it,
shouldn't
I
you
perfectly
expect
well
that
understand.
coming to study with you? Like if you're teaching race studies,
Yeah.
Shouldn't I expect to see stuff like that?
No, because they don't know anything about the history. And no student has ever left after I've done that. I think it's just a polite and considerate thing to do when you're presenting really raw material. And so a lot of people make fun of trigger warnings and so on and so forth. Oh, no, it's just being a decent human being.
Yeah, I'm not completely against that. I just worry about its efficiency. 'Cause for example, if you do the content warning,
Hmm.
it's probable that you'll signal someone out that wasn't even thinking of it, and that's
Sure.
what worries me. Or that you might put an elephant in the room that wasn't there before.
Well, I think I don't see how that would be likely to happen. I mean, I think most students become much more interested when I tell them that there's going to be this stuff. I've never had a student who left, um, and I don't anticipate having a student who would leave the class. Um, so yeah, I can't relate to that at all. Um, what the message they do get from me is that I care about their well-being.
Another thing related to the universities is
Hmm.
the no platforming for
Hmm.
bigotry or cancel culture. What's your view on that? Like, should white
I,
supremacists be verified on Twitter? I think so.
well, Twitter and universities, these are two different cases, right? Um, I I'm in general very reluctant to shut speech down. Uh, the other side of that, of course, is that speech can be extraordinarily dangerous. So if you look at the history of say national socialism, in the early days, like in
Yeah,
the 1920s, Nazis were always complaining that their free speech was being interfered with, that they were being that they were being deplatformed, and so on and so forth. Um, and indeed, as Goebbels said, the great irony of history is democracy has given us the very tool that we need to destroy it, which is freedom of speech. Um, so there are two considerations to balance there. One is the importance of protecting speech, and the other is a recognition of the dangerousness of some kinds of speech. And both of those need to be situated in a context. There are certain contexts in which speech of a certain sort can be extraordinarily dangerous, and other contexts where it isn't. So, yeah, I think that universities certainly universities shouldn't have no obligation to give people a platform who are spouting anti-intellectual nonsense. That's not part of the university. That's not what the university stands for. Um, s- and they're under no obligation to give people a platform that would require such high levels of security that the university couldn't afford it, or that might, or that one has good reason to believe would foment violence. Those are the exceptional conditions, but stuff short of that, I think it's far better for people to speak and to be, dealt with counter speech.
have you read about Jonathan Haidt?
Yeah, I know of him. Yeah,
Of him, yeah. Well, he's has his book, The Cuddling of the American Mind,
yeah.
and it worries about uh, removing dangers from our children, from their growth. And I worry that things like safe spaces and content warnings and stuff like that is creating a generation that is um, less trained to work with harm. But there's also a point that I think is fair, which is that there's less need to be harm in the world per se. So is it right that we start educating ourselves to repel harm, or should we still be exposing ourselves to that kind of growth?
Well, I mean, harm is by definition something to be avoided. And I really, I'm
Yeah, but
very,
avoiding
very,
harm at all costs means that you won't learn about everything.
well, of course you won't. Look, there are certain harms that are inevitable in life, and then there are surplus ones. And I don't think we need the surplus ones. All of us strive to avoid them, including you and me. Um, I don't believe for a moment that, you know, giving giving a trigger warning, or is it a content warning, as I prefer to say, is molding people's minds. It's just giving them a chance to prepare for what we're going to get into. So I really think there's a lot of moral panic around this stuff. Um, and if we want to look at um, if it's the case that children are excessively sheltered and that this has a dire effect on their development, I think we need to look elsewhere. We need to look at the video game industry. We need to look at iPads. We need to look at the way that we structure our societies, such that there are worries about the safety of children. Right? It's not what happens in a university, for Christ's sake.
All right.
In other words, if we're looking developmentally, if the claim is that um, children's or that people's development is interfered with by them being too insulated from experiences that might cause them discomfort or or danger. If that's let's just say that's the case, we need to look at the first 16 years more than what happens when they come to university, because that's when the real important developmental
When they're in
processes happen.
university, they're basically taught already.
Yeah, they're formed.
They're formed, yeah.
Yeah.
And that makes great sense. And it's
And if that's the case, look, let's go further. If that's the case, suppose that is the case, and I'm not saying any of this is the case.
yeah.
So let's suppose it is the case. Then surely it makes sense for teachers in universities to recognize the fact that they have been shaped in this sort of way and adapt their teaching to these people as they are, rather than suddenly expecting them to be different. Right?
That makes sense.
So it's like the veteran I told you about. Like it's slightly different, but it's an analogy, right? He was subjected to the horrors of war. It would make no sense for me to expect him to change. War has shaped him. And what would have been the decent thing for me if I had, note about these things, learning all the time, is to tell him before the class, look, we're going to be watching a film about a bunch of American soldiers committing a horrible massacre. Right?
No,
Because,
and
yeah,
it's a good idea. I don't think it's extremely hurtful because it's not crossing the line of censoring the information. It's just letting
no,
people
no,
know.
no, no. I know if we're teaching something, we shouldn't be censoring what we're teaching, because it's what we're teaching, right?
You just have to be careful with the information.
Yes, you have to handle the information in a way that it merits being handled.
Yeah, and that's important. As well, you've said that you hate many, maybe not hate, but don't relate to many of the modern terminology maybe
Mhm.
I'm using and the internet uses. So, what are your thoughts on systemic racism?
Uh, well, I think it's absolutely true or I have to get around the word racism here. It's certainly true um, that societies, well, let me go back a little bit. So, one of the things I work on is ideology, because ideology is, I think, intimately bound up with both dehumanization and what we can call racism,
Yeah,
right? So, what happens is um, certain sorts of beliefs and practices get sedimented into a society um, because of the advantages that they've given to one group of people at the expense of another. That's my understanding of ideology. So,
yeah.
practices and beliefs, right? And then lots of stuff gets built on them. It's like the foundation of a house. Um, so, what people call systemic racism, I look at it in that sort of way. The oppression
How
of
far can
Black
you go
people.
with that? It's is my question because
Oh,
I mean, systemic racism maybe goes to the beginning of society itself,
yeah, I think it does. Well, not necessarily, right. So, we have the term racism,
yeah,
forms of oppression.
probably not.
Let's say forms of oppression, right? Um, oh, I think that goes way, way back.
But my
And
question is how much of this is on paper today? Because I know it doesn't explicitly say you can't sell this to black
no,
people,
but that's the point. These things are not never on paper. They're just norms about how the world works.
but like for example, gerrymandering, which is
Yeah,
something that kind of still happens, but used to happen a lot in the past, and it's
yeah.
having repercussions nowadays.
Hmm.
That's systemic racism.
Well, if the function, if its function is to exclude um, certain constituencies from having a voice, and those constituencies are identified racially, yeah. But I don't think it's the best example. I think when we're talking about systemic racism, a much better example would be, say, the under resourcing of schools and sources of food, grocery stores in Black neighborhoods, right? So if you under resource these schools, and if students going to these schools are, say, malnourished, and if it's scary going to school because of violence in the neighborhood, which is itself a function of the whole structure of the neighborhood, then what you find is these students will be underrepresented when later on in university programs and in well-paying jobs and so on and so forth. That's what I sort of thing that I mean by systemic racism.
Uh, there's an important distinction that I'm puzzled by,
Hmm.
which is I think I mentioned it before in our talk, but for example, in that example of the supermarkets,
Yeah.
what's the difference between the supermarket in the black neighborhood being under resourced
Hmm.
if we are consciously trying to have those black children, well, those black supermarkets undernourished, sorry, under
No,
service.
no, no. So I don't see this as an intentional thing. That's the work
So just
to my
white
mind.
people are doing it to are helping themselves instead of helping the. I mean, in
It's
generalizing, obviously.
no. So when I talk about systemic racism, I mean something which is not intentionally racist. It's just the way a bunch of social norms and structures have panned out to disadvantage certain groups and advantage others, right? So the fact that it so we can go back actually. So let's think of poor Black neighborhoods. Of course, there are plenty of Black neighborhoods that are not poor. Poor Black neighborhoods. We have to ask ourselves how that happened, right? If we ask ourselves how that happened, then we can think more meaningfully about the fact that there is not the investment in those neighborhoods that is necessary to keep people well fed, healthy, and happy. So, what I think what we're looking at here is not some kind of, when people think of ideology, they think of some kind of conspiracy. Well, I think more often than not, it's not something conspiratorial. It's just the result, the cumulative result of practices and beliefs over time that fashions the world in such a way that
It's kind of a
some
cult
racialized groups
personality
are
without.
disadvantaged.
It's kind of a cult personality without constantly trying to make it that way. We're just used to it.
Yeah, that's right. It just seems like, oh, that's how things are. But whenever any state of affairs like that has a history, there's a story about how things got to be how they are. And then, of course, if you don't, if the people who are suffering are not valued by the people who are well resourced, then of course it just doesn't matter. And then the conclusion that a lot of people come to who don't understand the history and don't understand the suffering is, well, there's just something wrong with those black people. Look at the way they live. Well, and then of course that then feeds racist attitudes.
Something I saw online, which I'm trying, I'm having a hard time remembering the source, but
Okay.
it's an analysis of how when the slaves were freed in the South, they adopted the hate for intellectuality that the South already had, like the white South.
Okay.
The implications of that into their into the blacks' ideologies, because it's very common also in black families, like, oh, he's talking like a white guy because he's talking smart or he's talking school. And well, my question is, how real is that, and how much
I
of a
have
problem is it?
I have no idea. I mean,
Have you
people have
seen stuff like
certainly
that?
made that claim, but I'm very um,
Skeptical, I would be.
skeptical is maybe too strong. People make claims like this, and I would like to see real evidence for them rather than anecdotes. It is the case that immediately after emancipation, education became a top priority for Black people in the southern United States, and free elementary schooling was created. And that was, I believe it's true to say, the first free elementary schooling in the southern United States. So I'd be real careful with that caricature, and particularly when people talk about these big groups, Black people, right? So yeah, I'm sure that happens sometimes. I'm sure it doesn't happen other times, like with all of us.
And it's a symptom of a bigger problem. So,
Yeah, if it happens, it's a symptom of a bigger problem, and we need to look at the bigger problem. Be radical, go to the root.
so when we talk about reparations,
Mhm.
if I bring it a bit further back, because, well, for example, people complain about the conditions in which countries that were colonies were left after the Europeans left.
For sure.
My mother always says, well, that was 400 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't completely agree, but well, then our president, Andres Manuel, sent a card to the king of Spain
Uh-huh.
asking him to publicly apologize for the colonization, which I
Okay.
found extremely hilarious.
Yeah.
But I do think some sort of reparations are due from Europe to Africa and India and South
Mhm.
America.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that? And like, for
Yeah, I
example,
think,
in Haiti, when the Haitians started to revolutionize and the French just left, and they
yeah.
left them a country which is rotten.
Yeah, that's right. And it had been the wealthiest country in the Caribbean uh, previously. Yeah. Um,
Because people say, well, it was our ancestors, it wasn't us. Yeah, but you have that wealth. How do you make the claim that
well,
there's
but we're not talking about individuals. Look, so we're talking about governments. Um, so the fact that, well, on my father's side, my ancestors may well have owned slaves. Certainly not on my mother's side, but that's irrelevant. I mean, when my mother was alive and my grandparents were alive, we were Americans, and so we're part of this national entity. And that's what matters.
So you're part of the debt of the country that you're in.
Yeah, that's right. That's part of the price tag, right? You say you're American. Well, um, so yeah, I mean, I hate nationalism of all sorts, and
Are you a patriot?
no, in fact, I don't really understand patriotism properly. Um, and when I say I don't understand, I don't mean intellectually, I mean emotionally.
Yeah.
I believe in standing up for humanity wherever it is, and and doing our best to relieve suffering however we can. And so I'd rather frame it that way than in terms of the language of reparations. So what can we do? What have we done? How are our hands dirty? And everyone's hands are dirty. All nations are born in violence. And point is, what can we do? What can we do to make this a better world? And in in the Caribbean, when the British left, well, actually earlier, before the British left, they outlawed the slave trade, then they outlawed slavery. It was the slave owners who were paid reparations.
Oh,
And those have been these British reparations were still being paid last year
wow.
because the amount of money was just unbelievable, right?
To the owners of slaves.
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of British wealth was built on the backs of slaves, and the population of India and present day Pakistan, and it's all a big mess, and that has to be recognized.
What are your, sort of as a closing, what are your, maybe not predictions, but your fears
Mhm.
involving dehumanization,
Mhm.
possible future?
Yeah, well, my I my biggest fear has to do with the consequences of climate change, um, which many of us, I think including me, don't take seriously enough. But if you picture rising sea levels, low-lying nations being inundated, massive refugee problems. So just watch what happens when the population of Bangladesh attempts to pour into India. Um, I think this is a perfect setup for dehumanization and the associated atrocities.
So you mean the need that we're gonna have to mix with other races?
Yes, and the stress it's going to place. People are often xenophobic to begin with.
Like the refugee crisis in Europe.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's going to be small potatoes compared to the refugee crises in the wake of climate change, if something isn't done about it. And I do not believe anything's going to be done about it because
I'm not
people
gonna
are thinking short term. They're not thinking long term. That's how we tend to work. So that's my big worry. And so, given that, I think it's very important that we prepare ourselves. And that's really one of the reasons I wrote the book. Remember, it's dehumanization and how to resist it. There will be forces at play that are making it very tempting for us to dehumanize others, and we really need to push back against that. But we can't push back against it unless we understand it properly.
From a individual point of view, what do you think are, like, for example, if we talk about a soldier in the southern Mexico border
Yeah,
where they separated the families,
yeah.
do you think that the people who are hired to do this horrible things uh, use dehumanization as a resource to feel better with themselves?
I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know. I don't have any data to, so I try not to talk about things I really don't have
Yeah.
good, evidential grounds for. but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, it must. I can't believe they're all sociopaths. So it must be an extraordinary source of conflict for them. And then, well, people mm, find ways of diminishing the conflict. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of them drunk a lot of whiskey. Um, something to dull their sensibilities.
Yeah, probably makes it easier.
Yeah,
It's just I got I you left me a bit confused at the beginning when I asked you about if sociopaths,
yeah,
because you said not to go into that term.
yeah,
What's the
yeah,
difference between someone being a sociopath and someone being insensible?
yeah, yeah. So I shouldn't have gone. I shouldn't have used that term. In fact, so
Yeah,
for
but I wanted to ask the question anyways.
I don't like these. I don't think these psychiatric categories are always useful or accurate. So the real issue here is people who, for whatever reason, just don't care. They don't feel that sort of pain when they inflict pain on others. And a lot of people say sociopath, but that's actually tends to be used as a moral term now rather than a
So
medical
what's the
term.
difference between that and a psychopath?
I think they're supposed to be interchangeable.
Yeah, I've seen them used like that.
Yeah, yeah,
So
and
I worry because we think we have like if you say sociopath, maybe people won't be able to define it, but everyone knows what you're talking about.
yeah, and it's not me, right? That's
Obviously,
the idea. So it's helpful not to use that language, and that's actually a really useful corrective for me.
right? Do you have experience in psychology or just philosophy?
I used to be a psychotherapist, yeah, in
Clinically,
my former career.
it was a pleasure to have this talk. Really, I appreciate it so much.
Oh, that's nice, Omar. Thank you. It's very unusual. It was an unusual conversation. You went places that people usually don't go with me. So that was refreshing and really kept me on my feet.
Did I escape your expertise? I think in some at some points, but was the conversation relevant?
Oh yeah, no, it was a good conversation. It
Great.
was really good conversation. But like I was trying to say, it was different than usual. And that's fun. That's good. That gives me stuff to think about because I'll go away and I'll think about what we spoke about and think, so David, really, what do you think about that?